When my son called me at midnight asking for grocery money because his family was starving, I rushed to the ATM without question. It wasn't until I found his vacation photos on social media the next day that I realized I'd been funding his lies. For months. But what I discovered next made my blood run cold. He wasn't just stealing from me, he was destroying my life piece by piece, and he had help from someone I trusted completely. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Eleanor, and for 63 years, I thought I knew what love looked like. I raised my son Marcus as a single mother after his father walked out when he was just 2 years old. I worked double shifts at the textile factory, went back to school at night, and built a small but successful catering business from nothing. Every sacrifice felt worth it when I watched Marcus graduate college with honors, marry his college sweetheart Jessica, and start what seemed like a beautiful family with my 2 precious granddaughters, Lily and Rose. I lived in a modest 2-bedroom house in Riverside, California, the same house where I'd raised Marcus. The mortgage was paid off years ago, and my catering business, Eleanor's Kitchen, had given me a comfortable retirement. I wasn't wealthy, but I had enough to help my family when they needed it, and that felt like the greatest blessing of all. Marcus had always been charming, even as a child. Teachers loved him, neighbors adored him, and he had this way of making everyone feel special when he talked to them. He was the kind of son who remembered birthdays, called regularly, and always said the right thing. When he married Jessica 5 years ago, I welcomed her with open arms. She was quiet, sweet, and seemed to worship the ground Marcus walked on. Their first daughter, Lily, came 2 years later, followed by little Rose just 18 months ago. I fell in love with those girls the moment I held them. Being a grandmother felt like getting a second chance at the pure joy of loving a child, but without the constant worry of raising them alone. I babysat every weekend, bought them clothes and toys, and had started a college fund for each of them. The first call came on a Tuesday night in March. I was just settling into bed with a cup of chamomile tea and my crossword puzzle when my phone rang. Marcus's voice sounded strained, almost panicked. "Mom, I'm so sorry to call this late, but we're in a really tight spot. Jessica lost her job last week, and we're behind on everything. The girls need diapers and formula, and we don't have anything for groceries this week. I hate asking, but could you help us out? Just until Jessica finds something new?" My heart immediately went out to them. I knew how hard it was to raise children on one income, especially with rising costs. Without hesitation, I told him I'd transfer $500 first thing in the morning. He sounded so relieved, so grateful, promising he'd pay me back as soon as things turned around. "You're saving us, Mom. I don't know what we'd do without you. The girls are lucky to have such an amazing grandmother." Those words warmed my heart. This was what family was for, I told myself. This was why I'd worked so hard all those years, so I could be there when my son needed me. The calls became more frequent after that. Sometimes it was medical bills for one of the girls. Other times it was car repairs or utilities about to be shut off. Each story was compelling, each need urgent, and each request accompanied by Marcus's heartfelt gratitude and promises to pay me back. Jessica would sometimes get on the phone too, her voice small and apologetic, thanking me through what sounded like tears. "Eleanor, you're an angel," she'd whisper. "I promise we'll make this up to you somehow." By summer, I'd given them nearly $8,000. My savings account, which had once held enough for a comfortable retirement, was shrinking rapidly. But seeing my granddaughters healthy and happy made every penny worth it. When Marcus sent me photos of the girls playing in their backyard or videos of them taking their first steps, I felt like the luckiest grandmother alive. It was during one of these routine money requests that something shifted. Marcus called on a Saturday evening, his voice more desperate than usual. "Mom, I need you to listen carefully. We're in real trouble this time. The landlord is threatening eviction, and we have 24 hours to come up with $1,200 or we're out on the street. I can't let my daughters be homeless. Please, I'm begging you." The word begging hit me like a physical blow. My successful, college-educated son was begging me for money to keep his family housed. The maternal instinct in me roared to life, drowning out any rational thoughts about my depleted savings. "Of course, sweetheart. I'll wire it tonight. Don't worry about the girls, I won't let anything happen to them." But as I hung up and prepared to make the transfer, something nagged at me. The desperation in his voice had sounded almost theatrical. Like he was performing rather than truly panicking. I shook off the thought, chiding myself for being suspicious of my own son in his time of need. The next morning, I decided to surprise them with a visit. I hadn't seen the girls in 2 weeks, and after such a financial crisis, I wanted to check on everyone and maybe bring some groceries and a few gifts for Lily and Rose. I stopped at the toy store and picked out matching stuffed animals, then headed to their apartment complex in Moreno Valley. When I arrived at their building, I was confused. The address Marcus had given me led to a luxury complex with palm trees, a pool, and what looked like a fitness center. These weren't exactly the accommodations of a family on the verge of homelessness. Maybe they'd moved recently and hadn't updated their address with me? I called Marcus from the parking lot, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried Jessica's number with the same result. Deciding to wait, I parked under a shade tree and watched the building. 20 minutes later, I saw them. Marcus and Jessica emerged from the main entrance, dressed casually but expensively. Marcus wore designer jeans and a polo shirt I recognized as a brand that cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month. Jessica carried a large Gucci handbag and wore what looked like new athletic wear. But it wasn't their clothes that made my stomach drop. It was the fact that they were walking hand in hand toward a brand new silver BMW parked in the residence lot. I sat in my car, staring, as my son loaded golf clubs into the trunk of a car that probably cost more than I made in 2 years. Jessica checked her phone and laughed at something on the screen. They looked relaxed, happy, prosperous, nothing like a couple who just barely escaped homelessness. My hands shook as I started my car and drove home without approaching them. Questions swirled in my mind, each one more disturbing than the last. If they could afford luxury apartments and new cars, why did they need my money? If Jessica had lost her job, how were they maintaining this lifestyle? And most importantly, why had Marcus lied to me? That evening, I did something I'd never done before. I looked up Marcus on social media. I'd always respected his privacy, never feeling the need to monitor my adult son's online presence. What I found made me physically sick. His Instagram was full of recent photos I'd never seen. Marcus and Jessica at expensive restaurants, smiling over wine and elaborate meals. Pictures from what looked like a weekend getaway to a resort in Palm Springs, posted just 3 days after he'd called me begging for rent money. Jessica wearing the jewelry I'd seen her admire at the mall, items I knew cost hundreds of dollars. But the photo that broke my heart was the most recent one. It showed Marcus holding both girls on what appeared to be a yacht, with the caption, "Living our best life with these little angels." The date stamp showed it was taken the day after I'd wired him $1,200 for emergency rent. I stared at that photo until my eyes burned with tears. My granddaughters looked beautiful and happy, dressed in clothes I didn't recognize as any of the outfits I'd bought them. In the background, I could see Jessica laughing with a group of people I didn't know, all of them holding drinks that probably cost more than most families spent on dinner. My son wasn't struggling. He wasn't desperate. He was living a life of leisure while manipulating me into funding it. Every tearful phone call, every desperate plea, every promise to pay me back, all of it had been an elaborate performance designed to drain my retirement savings. I closed the laptop and sat in my dark kitchen for hours, trying to process what I'd learned. The son I'd raised, the man I'd sacrificed everything for, had been lying to my face for months. He'd used my love for my granddaughters as a weapon against me, knowing I'd never question anything if he claimed it was for their welfare. But as I sat there in the darkness, another thought crept in, one that chilled me even more than Marcus's betrayal. How was he affording this lifestyle if he was truly unemployed, as he claimed? Where was the money for the apartment, the car, the vacations, the expensive dinners? If my contributions were supposed to be keeping them afloat, what was actually paying for their real expenses? I made myself a cup of coffee despite the late hour and sat down with a notepad. I began writing down every request Marcus had made, every dollar I'd sent, every story he'd told me. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. The requests had started small and reasonable, then gradually increased in frequency and amount. Each crisis was more urgent than the last, each story more emotional and compelling. But there was something else, something that made my blood run cold as I traced the timeline. The timing of Marcus's calls often coincided with Jessica's social media posts about their expensive activities. He'd call me for emergency money on Friday, and by Monday, Jessica would be posting photos from a spa day or shopping trip. They weren't just lying to me about their financial situation, they were actively using my money to fund a lifestyle they knew I could never afford for myself. While I clipped coupons and shopped at discount stores to stretch my shrinking savings, they were treating my contributions like their personal entertainment budget. I thought about all the nights I'd lain awake worrying about their family, all the times I'd gone without small luxuries so I could help them more. I remembered the pride I'd felt when Marcus told me I was saving them, the joy I'd experienced thinking I was helping secure my granddaughter's future. All of it had been built on lies. As dawn broke over Riverside, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront Marcus immediately. If he was capable of this level of deception, I needed to understand the full scope of what was happening before I acted. I needed evidence, not just suspicions. And most importantly, I needed to know if anyone else was involved in this scheme. The next few days, I began paying closer attention to details I'd previously overlooked. When Marcus called me, I started asking more specific questions about their situation. Where exactly did they live now? What kind of car were they driving? Had Jessica started looking for work yet? His answers were vague and often contradictory, but delivered with such confidence that I might have believed them if I hadn't seen the truth with my own eyes. I also started documenting everything. Every phone call was discreetly recorded using an app one downloaded on my phone. Every text message was screenshotted and saved. Every bank transfer was printed and filed. If I was going to confront this betrayal, I wanted to be prepared. But the more I investigated, the more questions arose. During one of our conversations, Marcus mentioned that Jessica was watching the girls while he looked for work, but Jessica's social media showed her at what appeared to be a full-time job at a high-end marketing firm downtown. The photos were recent, showing her in business attire at what looked like client meetings and company events. If Jessica was working at a job that appeared to pay well, why were they still asking me for money? Why maintain the charade that she was unemployed? What were they really doing with the thousands of dollars I'd sent them? I decided to drive by Jessica's supposed workplace, an advertising agency in downtown Los Angeles. It took me 45 minutes in traffic, but I wanted to see for myself. I parked across the street and waited. Sure enough, at exactly 5:30 p.m., Jessica emerged from the building, laughing with a group of professionally dressed colleagues. She got into the BMW I'd seen at their apartment and drove away, looking every inch the successful businesswoman. My son and daughter-in-law weren't just lying about their financial situation, they were living completely fabricated lives. Jessica wasn't unemployed and desperate, she was thriving in what appeared to be a lucrative career. Marcus wasn't desperately searching for work. Based on his social media activity, he seemed to spend his days golfing, going to the gym, and meeting friends for lunch. But if that was true, then what was my money really funding? What did they need thousands of dollars for if they both had income and were living comfortably? The answer came to me in the most unexpected way. I was at the grocery store, the same one I'd been shopping at for 15 years, when I overheard a conversation between two women in the produce section. One of them was complaining about her neighbor's new boat, how the man next door was always bragging about his weekend fishing trips despite being unemployed. I swear, Sarah, I don't know how these people afford these toys. Jim hasn't worked in 2 years, but last month it was a motorcycle, this month it's a boat. Meanwhile, we're both working full-time and can barely afford our mortgage. Maybe he's got family money, the other woman suggested. You know how some people have parents who just keep bailing them out. The words hit me like a lightning bolt. I was Marcus's family money. I was the source that enabled their lifestyle upgrades, their luxury purchases, their recreational expenses. They weren't using my money for necessities, they were using it for toys, vacations, and status symbols while their actual income covered their real living expenses. I abandoned my shopping cart and sat in my car in the parking lot, shaking with rage and humiliation. They'd turned me into their personal ATM, dispensing cash whenever they wanted something new. Every desperate phone call, every tearful plea about the children, every promise to pay me back, all of it was just the price they paid for their guilt-free shopping sprees. But as the initial anger faded, it was replaced by something much more dangerous, cold, calculated fury. Marcus had underestimated me. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He saw me as an easy mark, a lonely old woman so desperate for connection with her family that she'd believe any story he told her. He thought my love for my granddaughters made me gullible and manipulable. He was about to learn how wrong he was. That night, I sat down at my computer and began the real investigation. If Marcus and Jessica thought they could defraud me with impunity, they clearly didn't understand who they were dealing with. I hadn't built a successful business by being naive or trusting. I'd learned to read people, to spot inconsistencies, and to protect my interests. I started by pulling my bank records for the past 6 months, documenting every transfer I'd made to Marcus. The total was staggering, over $15,000. Money I'd worked decades to save, money I'd planned to use for my own security in my golden years, money that was supposed to be there if I ever faced a real emergency. Next, I began systematically going through Marcus's and Jessica's social media accounts, not just the recent posts but months of history. I screenshotted everything, photos of expensive dinners, luxury purchases, weekend getaways, designer clothes. I created a timeline that clearly showed their actual lifestyle alongside the timeline of their supposed financial crises. The pattern was even more damning than I'd initially realized. Every time Marcus called me for emergency money, it was followed within days by evidence of recreational spending. The urgent rent money had been followed by a weekend ski trip. The emergency medical bills for Lily had been followed by Jessica posting photos of a new handbag collection. The money for back-to-school clothes for the girls had been followed by Marcus buying a new set of golf clubs. But the most disturbing discovery came when I looked deeper into their financial situation. Using public records and a little detective work, I found that Marcus and Jessica weren't renting that luxury apartment, they owned it. Not only that, but they'd purchased it with a substantial down payment just 3 months before Marcus started his sob stories about financial hardship. They'd bought a $500,000 condo and then immediately began calling me for money, claiming they couldn't afford basic necessities. The timing was so brazenly calculated that it took my breath away. They'd leveraged their new purchase as an excuse to drain my savings, knowing I'd never question helping my son and granddaughters. As I compiled this evidence, I realized I was looking at more than just casual dishonesty. This was a systematic, premeditated financial fraud. Marcus hadn't stumbled into lying to me, he'd planned it. The story about Jessica losing her job, the claims about struggling to make ends meet, the desperate calls about emergencies, all of it had been carefully orchestrated to extract as much money from me as possible. But I still had one more question that needed answering. How long had this been going on? Was this a recent development, or had Marcus been lying to me about his financial situation from the beginning? I spent the next several days making discreet inquiries. I called Jessica's mother, Patricia, whom I'd always had a good relationship with. During a casual conversation about the grandchildren, I mentioned how proud I was of Jessica for finding a new job after being unemployed. Patricia sounded confused. Unemployed? Jessica's never been unemployed. She's been with Morrison & Associates for 3 years now. In fact, she just got promoted to senior account manager last month. They're doing so well financially that they're talking about buying a vacation home in Big Bear. My heart pounded as I processed this information. Jessica had never lost her job. The entire foundation of Marcus's financial emergency stories was a complete fabrication. They'd been lying to me from the very first phone call, creating fictional crises to justify taking my money. But Patricia wasn't done sharing. As she continued talking about Jessica's success, she mentioned something that made my blood run cold. You know, Eleanor, I'm so glad Jessica has someone like you to talk to about financial planning. She mentioned that you've been giving them investment advice, helping them figure out how to handle their extra income. It's so sweet of you to share your business experience with them. Investment advice. Extra income. Patricia thought I was helping Marcus and Jessica manage their surplus money, not giving them emergency funds for basic survival. They'd been telling Jessica's family a completely different story about our financial relationship, one that painted me as a helpful advisor rather than a desperate grandmother being manipulated into supporting them. The scope of their deception was breathtaking. They weren't just lying to me, they were lying to everyone, crafting different narratives for different audiences. To me, they were struggling parents in need of rescue. To Jessica's family, they were successful young professionals seeking wise counsel. To their friends on social media, they were living their best life without a care in the world. I hung up with Patricia and sat in stunned silence. The son I'd raised, the man I'd sacrificed everything for, wasn't just a liar, he was a sophisticated con artist. He'd studied me, learned my weaknesses, identified my pressure points, and crafted a long-term strategy to exploit them. My love for my granddaughters wasn't just convenient for his scheme, it was the cornerstone of it. But as I sat there processing the full extent of Marcus's betrayal, I realized something else. He'd made one crucial mistake in his elaborate con game. He'd assumed I was helpless, that my love for him and the girls would make me permanently gullible, that I'd never fight back or demand accountability. Marcus had forgotten that his sweet, generous mother was also the woman who'd built a successful business from nothing, who'd navigated the complexities of contracts and negotiations, who'd learned to protect herself in a world that often took advantage of women like her. He'd forgotten that Eleanor's kitchen hadn't survived and thrived for 20 years by accident. It had succeeded because I was smart, resourceful, and absolutely ruthless when someone tried to cheat me. My son was about to get a very expensive education about the woman who'd raised him. And unlike the money I'd already given him, this lesson was going to cost him everything. The next morning, I began phase 2 of my investigation. If Marcus thought he could manipulate me indefinitely, I needed to understand the full scope of his operation. How much money had he really taken from me? What was he actually spending it on? And most importantly, who else might be involved in this scheme? I made an appointment with my bank manager, a woman named Carol who'd helped me for years. I explained that I needed to review all my recent transactions because I suspected I might be the victim of financial fraud. Carol was immediately concerned and helpful, walking me through months of my banking activity. The picture that emerged was even worse than I'd imagined. In the past 8 months, I'd transferred over $22,000 to Marcus. $22,000 that had come from my retirement savings, my emergency fund, and the money I'd set aside for my own future care. But Carol's analysis revealed something else disturbing. The pattern of my transfers to Marcus coincided with unusual activity in my checking account. Small charges I didn't remember making, subscription services I'd never signed up for, automatic withdrawals for services I'd never authorized. Eleanor, Carol said carefully, I need to ask you something sensitive. Does anyone else have access to your banking information? Your PIN number, your online passwords, anything like that? I thought about it carefully. Marcus had been in my house countless times. He'd seen me use my computer, watch me pay bills online. Last year, when I'd been sick with the flu, he'd even offered to help me with my banking while I recovered. I'd given him my login information. Temporarily, trusting him completely. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Marcus hadn't just been asking me for money, he'd been taking it without permission. Those small charges, those mysterious subscriptions, they weren't mistakes. Or oversights. They were Marcus systematically draining my accounts in amounts small enough that I wouldn't notice immediately. Carol, I said, my voice barely steady, I think my son has been stealing from me. The next few hours were a blur of paperwork, fraud reports, and phone calls. Carol helped me secure my accounts, change all my passwords, and document the unauthorized transactions. The bank's fraud department launched an immediate investigation, and I was advised to contact the police if I had evidence of financial elder abuse. Financial elder abuse. The term felt like a slap across the face. I was the victim of elder abuse, perpetrated by my own son. The child I'd raised with such love and hope had grown into a man who saw me as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. But as devastating as this revelation was, it also clarified something important. This wasn't just about money anymore. Marcus had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. He hadn't just lied to me or manipulated me, he'd stolen from me. He'd committed crimes against his own mother, crimes that could send him to prison. I drove home from the bank in a daze, my mind reeling with the implications of what I'd learned. Marcus's betrayal wasn't just personal, it was criminal. The money he'd taken wasn't just a family dispute, it was theft. The lies he'd told weren't just hurtful, they were fraud. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something other than heartbreak and betrayal. I felt power. Because unlike the emotional manipulation Marcus had been using against me, financial crimes left paper trails. Unlike family drama, theft was something the legal system could address. Unlike personal betrayals, fraud had consequences that Marcus couldn't charm or lie his way out of. My son had made the biggest mistake of his life when he decided to steal from me. He'd given me something I hadn't had before, legal recourse. And I intended to use every bit of it. That evening, I sat down at my kitchen table with all the evidence I'd gathered, bank records, social media screenshots, documentation of Marcus's lies, proof of their real financial situation. The pile of papers was substantial, damning, and absolutely clear in its implications. Marcus had been running a sophisticated, long-term financial fraud against his own mother. He'd stolen over $22,000 from a retired woman, living on a fixed income. He'd used his children as emotional leverage to extract money under false pretenses. He'd systematically accessed my bank accounts without permission and stolen additional funds in small increments designed to avoid detection. In any court of law, this evidence would be devastating. Marcus wouldn't just face family disappointment or personal embarrassment, he'd face criminal charges for elder abuse, financial fraud, and theft. Jessica, as his willing accomplice, would likely face charges as well. Their comfortable lifestyle, their luxury purchases, their social media-worthy adventures, all of it would be exposed as the proceeds of criminal activity. But as I sat there looking at this mountain of evidence, I realized I had a choice to make. I could turn everything over to the police immediately and watch my son's life implode in the most public and devastating way possible. Or I could give him one last chance to face the truth of what he'd done and make it right. The second option wasn't about forgiveness or family loyalty. It was about strategy. If I moved against Marcus legally right away, he'd have time to prepare a defense. Maybe even destroy evidence or manipulate witnesses. But if I confronted him first, if I gave him the opportunity to confess and make restitution, his response would tell me everything I needed to know about whether he was salvageable or irredeemably corrupt. More importantly, it would give me the satisfaction of watching him realize that his sweet, trusting mother had outmaneuvered him completely. Marcus thought he was the smart one, the one who'd figured out how to game the system and exploit family loyalty. He was about to learn that he'd been playing checkers while I'd been playing chess. I picked up my phone and scrolled to Marcus's number. My finger hovered over the call button for a long moment as I considered my options. I could confront him now, immediately, while my anger was white-hot and my evidence was fresh. Or I could wait, plan my approach, maybe even gather a little more information about the full scope of his operation. In the end, I chose patience. Marcus had been planning his fraud for months, maybe longer. He'd carefully constructed his lies and systematically executed his theft. If I was going to beat him at his own game, I needed to be just as careful and strategic. I set the phone down and returned to my evidence files. Tomorrow, I would begin the final phase of my investigation. I would gather the last pieces of information I needed, prepare for every possible response Marcus might have, and plan my confrontation. Down to the smallest detail. Marcus had spent months thinking he was smarter than his mother, that he could manipulate and control me indefinitely. He'd used my love against me, exploited my trust, and stolen my security. But he'd forgotten one crucial thing about the woman who'd raised him. I didn't just teach him how to be charming and persuasive. I'd also taught him the value of hard work, the importance of honesty, and the consequences of betraying the people who loved you. Unfortunately for Marcus, he'd only learned half the lesson. Now it was time for him to learn the rest. The next morning brought another one of Marcus's calls. This time, his story involved an emergency room visit for little Rose, supposedly for a severe allergic reaction that required expensive treatment not covered by their insurance. The bill was $3,000, and they needed it paid immediately. Or the hospital would send the account to collections. I listened to his performance with new ears, analyzing every word, every emotional manipulation, every calculated pause designed to maximize my sympathy. Marcus had clearly practiced this routine, perfecting his delivery to push all my buttons. As a worried grandmother, "Mom, I know I've been asking for a lot lately, but this is about Rose's health. The doctors say if we don't get this treated properly, it could affect her development. I can't live with myself if something happens to her because we couldn't afford her medical care." The mention of Rose's development was particularly clever. Marcus knew I'd researched child development extensively when he was young, and that any threat to my granddaughter's cognitive or physical growth would send me into protective overdrive. But instead of rushing to transfer money, I asked questions. Detailed questions about the hospital, the doctor's name, the specific treatment Rose had received. Marcus's answers were vague and inconsistent, delivered with increasing irritation. That I wasn't immediately complying with his request. "Mom, I don't understand why you're interrogating me about this. Rose is in pain, and we need your help. Can you just trust me for once?" The phrase, "trust me for once," was particularly galling, given that I'd been trusting him blindly for months while he systematically robbed me. But I kept my voice calm and concerned, playing the role he expected. "Of course I trust you, sweetheart. I just want to make sure Rose gets the best care possible. Maybe I could call the hospital directly and pay the bill myself, so you don't have to worry about handling the money transfer while you're dealing with everything else." There was a long pause. I could practically hear Marcus scrambling to come up with a reason why direct payment wouldn't work. "That's really thoughtful, Mom, but they require payment from the account holder. Something about privacy regulations. If you could just transfer it to me, I'll take care of it right away." Privacy regulations that prevented grandmothers from paying grandchildren's medical bills. The lie was so transparent it was almost insulting. Marcus really did think I was completely gullible. "I understand," I said gently. "Let me check my account balance and call you right back." I hung up and immediately called the children's hospital Marcus had mentioned. When I explained that I was trying to verify a recent emergency room visit for my granddaughter, the operator was helpful but clear. They had no record of any patient named Rose with Marcus's last name being treated in the past week. No emergency room visit. No allergic reaction. No $3,000 medical bill. Marcus had fabricated the entire crisis, confident that I'd never verify his story. But I wasn't done investigating. I called Jessica's cell phone, knowing that if there really was a medical emergency involving Rose, she'd be frantic and distracted. Instead, she answered on the first ring, sounding relaxed and cheerful. "Eleanor. How nice to hear from you. What's going on?" I played confused and concerned. "Jessica, I just heard about Rose's trip to the emergency room. Is she okay?" Marcus sounded so worried when he called. The silence that followed was telling. I could hear Jessica's brain working, trying to figure out what story Marcus had told me and how she should respond. "Oh, that," she said finally. "Yes, it was scary at the time, but Rose is fine now. Kids, you know? They bounce back so quickly." Her response was perfectly generic, designed to acknowledge the supposed crisis without providing any details that might contradict Marcus's version. If there had been a real emergency, Jessica would have been eager to share specifics about Rose's condition, the treatment she'd received, how frightening the experience had been. Instead, she was clearly improvising, trying to support Marcus's lie without knowing exactly what she was supposed to be supporting. "I'm so relieved," I said. "Marcus mentioned something about expensive treatment not covered by insurance. I hope that's not going to be a financial burden for you." Another pause. "We're managing," Jessica said carefully. "Marcus is handling all of that." No mention of the $3,000 bill. No gratitude for my offer to help. No details about the uncovered treatment. Jessica was trying to end the conversation as quickly as possible without saying anything that might expose the fabrication. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen and marveled at the coordination required for their deception. Marcus and Jessica had to constantly stay in sync about their lies, making sure their stories matched when I called. They had to remember which crises they'd already used, which emergencies they'd already resolved with my money, which sob stories were still available for future use. It was an exhausting way to live, constantly maintaining false narratives and manufacturing emergencies. But apparently, it was worth it to them as long as the money kept flowing. I called Marcus back and told him I'd transfer the $3,000 within the hour. His relief was palpable, his gratitude effusive. He promised again to pay me back as soon as possible, assured me that Rose was getting the best possible care, and told me I was the most wonderful mother and grandmother in the world. Then I hung up and didn't transfer a single penny. Instead, I spent the afternoon taking screenshots of Marcus's and Jessica's latest social media activity. True to form, they were posting about their day in real time. Marcus at the golf course with friends, Jessica shopping at an upscale boutique, both of them looking relaxed and carefree. No sign of a medical emergency, no indication that they were spending the day at a hospital with a sick child. By evening, Marcus called again. This time, his tone was different, less grateful, more demanding. "Mom, I checked our account and the money didn't come through. The hospital is calling about the bill. We really need you to send it tonight." I apologized and blamed a problem with my banking app, promising to handle it first thing in the morning. Marcus was clearly frustrated but couldn't push too hard without revealing his desperation for money that was supposedly needed for his daughter's emergency medical care. The next morning, I didn't transfer any money. I also didn't answer Marcus's increasingly frequent calls. By afternoon, his voicemails had shifted from concern to irritated to barely controlled anger. "Mom, I don't know what's going on, but Rose needs this treatment and you promised to help. Call me back immediately." By evening, Jessica was calling too. Her messages were different in tone, hurt, confused, worried that something had happened to me. "Eleanor, we haven't heard from you all day. Are you okay? We're really worried. Please call us back when you get this." Their different approaches were telling. Marcus was focused on the money, angry that his usual manipulation wasn't working. Jessica was trying emotional manipulation, playing the concerned daughter-in-law worried about my well-being. But neither of them suggested taking Rose to a different hospital, finding alternative payment arrangements, or any of the things desperate parents would actually do if their child needed urgent medical care. Because they knew there was no emergency, no sick child, no medical bills. They were just frustrated that their latest con wasn't working as smoothly as usual. On the third day, Marcus showed up at my house unannounced. I watched from my window. As he got out of his BMW and walked toward my front door with the confident stride of someone who expected to get his way. He was dressed in expensive casual clothes, his hair perfectly styled, looking nothing like a man dealing with a family medical crisis. I let him knock 3 times before opening the door. When I did, I made sure to look tired and slightly confused. As if I'd been napping. "Marcus? What a surprise. Is everything all right?" His smile was tight, his eyes sharp with barely concealed frustration. "Mom, we've been trying to reach you for days. Why haven't you been answering your phone?" I invited him in, playing the role of the scattered elderly woman he clearly thought I was. "Oh honey, I've been having such trouble with that new phone. All these buttons and notifications, I can barely keep track of anything anymore." Marcus followed me into the living room, his impatience obvious despite his attempts to seem concerned. "Mom, we really need to talk about Rose's medical situation. The hospital is pressuring us about payment, and we're running out of time." I settled into my favorite armchair and looked at him with what I hoped appeared to be grandmotherly worry. "Of course, sweetheart. Tell me exactly what's happening with my precious Rose." For the next 10 minutes, Marcus spun an elaborate tale about Rose's ongoing treatment, the complications that had developed, the specialists who needed to be consulted. His story was detailed and compelling, clearly something he'd been rehearsing during the 3 days I'd been ignoring his calls. But as he talked, I noticed something interesting. Marcus kept checking his watch, glancing at his phone, and shifting restlessly in his seat. His body language suggested someone who was in a hurry, not someone whose child was facing a medical crisis. It sounds absolutely terrifying, I said when he finished. Poor little Rose. She must be so uncomfortable. Marcus nodded gravely. She is. That's why we need to get this payment handled today. Every hour we delay makes her situation worse. I reached for my purse, watching Marcus's eyes light up with anticipation. But instead of pulling out my checkbook, I retrieved my reading glasses and a small notebook. Let me write down all the details, I said, opening the notebook with trembling hands that I hoped looked authentically elderly. I want to make sure I understand everything correctly. What was the name of the doctor again? Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Dr. Henderson. I told you that. I wrote slowly, deliberately, my handwriting shaky. And what hospital was this? Children's Medical Center. Mom, we've been over this. Of course, of course. And what exactly is wrong with Rose again? These medical terms are so confusing for someone my age. I watched Marcus struggle to maintain his patience as I asked for increasingly specific details about Rose's supposed condition. His answers became more vague and contradictory as he realized I was taking notes that could be verified. Finally, he stood up abruptly. Mom, I don't have time for this right now. Rose needs treatment, and we need the money today. Can you just write the check so I can get back to the hospital? I looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes. Oh, of course, darling. I just want to make sure I send the money to the right place. Maybe I should come with you to the hospital? I'd love to see Rose and make sure she's getting the best care. The suggestion clearly horrified Marcus. That's not necessary. The doctors are very strict about visitors during treatment. It's better if you just handle the payment from here. I understand. But maybe I could call the hospital myself and arrange payment directly? That way you wouldn't have to worry about handling the money transfer while you're dealing with everything else. Marcus's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the frustration and anger underneath. Mom, we've been through this. They require payment from the account holder. If you could just trust me to handle this. The word trust hung in the air between us. I let the silence stretch, watching Marcus realize how his demand sounded in the context of a supposed medical emergency. Of course I trust you, I said finally. You're my son. But Rose is my granddaughter, and I want to make sure she gets the best possible care. Maybe you could give me Dr. Henderson's number so I can discuss her condition directly? Marcus was trapped. He couldn't refuse to provide the doctor's contact information without seeming suspicious, but he obviously couldn't give me a number for a doctor who didn't exist. The doctors are very busy, he said weakly. They don't have time to talk to family members about payment issues. I nodded sympathetically. I'm sure they are busy. But surely they'd want to know that Rose's grandmother is concerned about her treatment? I have some experience with medical situations, you know. I might be able to ask helpful questions. The conversation continued in circles for another 20 minutes, with Marcus becoming increasingly agitated as I persisted in asking reasonable questions that he couldn't answer. Finally, he gave up trying to maintain the pretense of a concerned father. Mom, I don't have time for this interrogation. Either you trust me enough to help your granddaughter, or you don't. Which is it? The emotional manipulation was clumsy. And obvious now that I was looking for it. Marcus was trying to make me feel guilty for asking reasonable questions about a supposed medical emergency. He was using my love for Rose as a weapon against my common sense. I stood up slowly, moving. Like the frail elderly woman he apparently thought I was. You're absolutely right, Marcus. I should trust you. Let me get my checkbook. Relief flooded his face as I walked toward my desk. But instead of reaching for my checkbook, I opened the top drawer and pulled out a manila folder. Before I write the check, I said, returning to my chair, I wanted to show you something that's been worrying me. Marcus looked confused as I opened the folder and began pulling out printed screenshots. His confusion turned to alarm as he recognized his own social media posts. I've been looking at your Facebook pictures, I said conversationally, and I noticed something odd. According to these timestamps, you were at the golf course yesterday afternoon, the same time you called me from the hospital about Rose's emergency treatment. Marcus stared at the photos, his face cycling through surprise, panic, and calculation. Those are old pictures. Facebook sometimes posts things with the wrong date. I nodded understandingly and pulled out another set of screenshots. That's what I thought too. But then I saw Jessica's Instagram posts from yesterday. She was at a spa in Beverly Hills, getting what looked like a very expensive treatment. The timestamp shows she posted it while you were supposedly at the hospital. With Rose. Mom, I can explain. I'm sure you can, I said gently, pulling out more evidence. I also have pictures from your weekend in Palm Springs last month, right after you called me about needing rent money to avoid eviction. And these receipts from expensive restaurants throughout the week you claimed Jessica was too sick to work. With each piece of evidence I revealed, Marcus looked more desperate. His carefully constructed lies were collapsing in real time, and he could see years of deception falling apart in front of him. And then there's this, I continued, pulling out my bank statements. Documentation of every transfer I've made to you over the past 8 months. $22,000, Marcus. $22,000 that came from my retirement savings, based on stories that were apparently complete fabrications. Marcus opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was staring at the evidence spread across my coffee table, realizing, for the first time, that his sweet, trusting mother had been conducting a thorough investigation of his activities. But the most interesting discovery, I said, my voice still gentle but with an edge that Marcus was finally hearing, was when I called Children's Medical Center yesterday. They have no record of Rose being treated there at any time in the past month. The last piece of evidence was Marcus's breaking point. His shoulders sagged, his face went pale, and for a moment, he looked like the scared little boy he'd once been when caught in a lie. Mom, I can explain everything. I'm sure you'll try, I said, my voice no longer gentle. But first, I think we need to discuss something else. You see, when I was reviewing my bank records with my financial advisor, we discovered some interesting discrepancies. I pulled out a different set of papers, bank statements highlighted in yellow. Small charges to my account that I didn't authorize. Subscription services I never signed up for. Automatic withdrawals for services I've never heard of. All of them started shortly after you helped me with my online banking when I was sick last year. Marcus's face had gone from pale to gray. He was staring at the bank statements like they were a death sentence. The bank's fraud department was very helpful, I continued. They were able to trace all of these unauthorized charges. Apparently, someone used my banking information to set up recurring payments to various services. The total amount over the past year was about $4,000. I looked directly into Marcus's eyes, watching him realize that I knew about his theft as well as his fraud. $4,000 in unauthorized charges, plus $22,000 obtained through fraudulent emergency claims. That's $26,000, Marcus. $26,000 stolen from your elderly mother. The word stolen hung in the air like a physical presence. Marcus finally understood that this wasn't just about family disappointment or hurt feelings. This was about criminal activity with serious legal consequences. Mom, please, let me explain. It's not what you think. It's exactly what I think, I said, standing up and walking to my desk. And I have something else to show you. I returned with another folder, this one thick with official-looking documents. I've been very busy this week, Marcus. I've filed reports with the bank's fraud department, the police financial crimes unit, and the district attorney's office for elder abuse. Marcus shot to his feet, his composure finally cracking completely. You called the police? Mom, you can't be serious. I'm your son. Yes, you are my son, I said calmly. The son I raised to be honest and responsible. The son I worked 2 jobs to put through college. The son I trusted with my financial information when I needed help. And you repaid that trust by stealing from me for over a year. I didn't steal anything. You gave me that money willingly. I gave you money based on lies about medical emergencies and financial crises that never existed. That's called fraud, Marcus. And the unauthorized charges to my account? That's theft. Both are serious crimes, especially when committed against an elderly person. Marcus began pacing, his panic evident. This is insane. You're my mother. Families help each other. You can't have me arrested for accepting help from my own mother. Help? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Is that what you call fabricating medical emergencies involving my granddaughters? Is that what you call stealing my banking information and setting up unauthorized withdrawals? Is that what you call lying to me for months while you funded your luxury lifestyle with my retirement savings? I opened the second folder and began laying out more documents. Here's what help actually looks like, Marcus. This is the college fund I started for Lily and Rose, funded with money from my business. This is the life insurance policy I bought with them as beneficiaries. This is the will I had updated last year, leaving you and your family my house and everything I've worked for. Marcus stopped pacing and stared at the documents, finally understanding the full scope of what he'd been risking with his deception. I was already planning to help you, I continued. I was already ensuring your family's financial security. You didn't need to steal from me or lie to me. All you had to do was be honest about your situation, and I would have found a way to help that didn't involve draining my current savings. Mom, I didn't know about any of this. Because you never asked. You never had an honest conversation with me about money or your future or your family's needs. Instead, you chose to treat me like a mark to be conned, a resource to be exploited until it was exhausted. I gathered up all the evidence and returned it to the folders. The police investigation is already underway. The bank has provided them with documentation of all the unauthorized transactions. I've given them recordings of your fraudulent emergency calls and evidence that your supposed crises never actually occurred. Marcus sank back into his chair, the weight of his situation finally hitting him. What are you saying? I'm saying, you're going to be arrested, Marcus. You're going to be charged with elder financial abuse, fraud, and theft. You're going to face trial, and based on the evidence I've collected, you're going to be convicted. But the girls. Jessica. This will destroy our family. Your choices destroyed our family, I said firmly. Your decision to steal from me, to lie to me, to exploit my love for my granddaughters, those were the choices that destroyed our family. I'm just making sure there are consequences for those choices. Marcus looked up at me with desperate eyes. What if I pay it all back? Every penny, with interest. We can work out a payment plan. I'll get a second job, sell the car, whatever it takes. Please don't do this to me. I considered his offer, watching him squirm as he waited for my response. $26,000, Marcus. That's what you owe me. Not just the transfers you asked for, but the money you stole through unauthorized charges. When can you have that money in my account? I don't know. I'd have to liquidate some investments, maybe take a loan against the condo. The condo you bought while claiming you couldn't afford rent? The investments you made with money you stole from your mother? Marcus's face flushed with embarrassment. And anger. Fine. Yes. I made some poor choices. But I can fix this. Just give me a chance to make it right. Poor choices. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the neighborhood where I'd raised him. Marcus, what you did wasn't poor choices. It was calculated criminal activity carried out over more than a year. You studied my weaknesses, planned your approach, and systematically exploited my love for my family to steal my life savings. I turned back to face him. And even now, faced with irrefutable evidence of what you've done, you're not expressing remorse or guilt. You're not apologizing for betraying my trust or for the stress you've caused me. You're just trying to negotiate your way out of consequences. I am sorry. Of course I'm sorry. I never meant for it to go this far. You're sorry you got caught, I corrected. If I hadn't discovered your deception, you'd still be calling me with fake emergencies, still stealing money from my accounts, still treating me like your personal ATM. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him trying to find a new angle, a different approach that might save him. Finally, he looked up with what I recognized as his childhood expression when he was about to try his most manipulative plea. Mom, I know I made mistakes. But think about Lily and Rose. If I go to prison, what happens to them? They're innocent in all this. Do you really want your granddaughters to grow up knowing their father is a convicted felon? The emotional manipulation was breathtaking in its cynicism. Marcus was using my love for his children as a shield against the consequences of his crimes, just as he'd used it as a weapon to facilitate those crimes. You should have thought about Lily and Rose before you decided to commit felonies, I said coldly. You should have considered their future before you chose to steal from their grandmother. You should have worried about their security before you risked everything on a criminal scheme that was guaranteed to eventually be discovered. Please, Mom. I'm begging you. Don't destroy my family over this. I'm not destroying your family, Marcus. You destroyed your family when you chose crime over honesty, theft over trust, manipulation over love. I'm just making sure that your choices have appropriate consequences. I walked back to my desk and picked up my phone. The detective handling your case wants to interview you. You can either contact him voluntarily, or you can wait for him to contact you. But either way, this investigation is moving forward. Marcus jumped up from his chair, his desperation finally overriding his attempts at manipulation. You can't do this to me. I'm your son. After everything I've been through, after losing my father, after struggling to build a life for my family. This is how you repay me? The outburst revealed everything I needed to know about Marcus's true character. Faced with the consequences of his crimes, he wasn't taking responsibility or expressing genuine remorse. He was blaming me for his situation, acting as if his decision to steal from me was somehow my fault. Get out, I said quietly. What? Get out of my house. Now. Marcus stared at me, clearly not believing what he was hearing. Mom, you can't be serious. We need to talk about this. We need to work something out. There's nothing to work out. You stole from me. You lied to me. You exploited my love for my granddaughters to fund your selfish lifestyle. And when confronted with evidence of your crimes, your only concern is avoiding consequences. I walked to the front door and opened it. You have 5 minutes to leave my property before I call the police and have you removed for trespassing. Marcus followed me to the door, his anger finally overriding his attempts at charm. This is ridiculous. You're destroying our family over money. Money that I was going to pay back anyway. You weren't going to pay back anything, I said. You were going to keep stealing until you'd taken everything I had. And then you probably would have moved on to Jessica's parents, or started borrowing against the girl's future. You don't know what you're talking about. I know exactly what I'm talking about. I know that you bought a $500,000 condo and then immediately started calling me for emergency money. I know that you've been living a luxury lifestyle while claiming poverty. I know that you accessed my bank accounts without permission and stole thousands of dollars in small increments. Marcus stepped closer, his face flushed with anger. You think you're so smart, don't you? You think you've figured everything out. But you don't understand the pressure I'm under, the expectations, the need to provide for my family. I understand. Pressure, I said firmly. I raised you as a single mother while working multiple jobs and building a business. I know what it means to struggle financially and worry about providing for your child. But I never once considered stealing from my own family to solve my problems. That's different. You didn't have the same opportunities, the same social pressures. Social pressures? I laughed incredulously. You stole $26,000 from your elderly mother because of social pressures? You committed crimes against the woman who raised you because you were worried about what other people thought of your lifestyle? Marcus's mask had completely slipped now. The charming, grateful son was gone, replaced by an entitled, angry man who felt victimized by the consequences of his own choices. You don't understand what it's like to be my age and not have achieved everything you thought you would. Jessica's friends are all successful, living in nice houses, taking expensive vacations. I couldn't let her be embarrassed by being married to someone who couldn't provide that lifestyle. So you stole it, I said simply. Instead of working harder, getting a better job, or adjusting your expectations, you decided to steal your lifestyle from your mother. I was going to pay it back. When? How? You've been stealing from me for over a year, and the amounts have only increased. You weren't paying anything back, you were escalating your theft because it was working so well. Marcus stood in my doorway, breathing heavily, his face a mixture of rage and desperation. If you do this, if you have me arrested, I'll never forgive you. Lily and Rose will never forgive you. You'll lose your son and your granddaughters forever. The threat was designed to be my breaking point, the moment when my fear of losing my family would override my demand for justice. Marcus was betting that I'd cave under the pressure of potentially losing access to my granddaughters. But he'd miscalculated completely. Marcus, I said sadly, I already lost my son. The son I raised would never steal from his mother. The son I raised would never use his children as emotional leverage to commit crimes. The son I raised would never threaten his own mother when confronted with his wrongdoing. I stepped back and began closing the door. I don't know who you've become, but you're not the child I raised. Maybe prison will give you time to remember the values I tried to teach you. Mom, wait. I closed the door and locked it, then watched through the window as Marcus stood on my porch for several minutes, clearly trying to process what had just happened. Finally, he walked back to his BMW and drove away, his tires squealing as he left my neighborhood. I returned to my living room and sat down among all the evidence I'd gathered, feeling emotionally drained but also strangely relieved. For months, I'd been living with the stress of Marcus's constant emergencies, the worry about my granddaughter's welfare, the confusion about my dwindling savings. Now, finally, I knew the truth. My son was a criminal who'd been systematically stealing from me, and I was going to make sure he faced appropriate consequences for his actions. But even as I felt relief about ending the deception, I also felt profound sadness about what this meant for my relationship with Lily and Rose. Marcus had threatened to keep them from me, and I knew he was probably capable of turning them against me as they grew older. The thought of losing my granddaughters was devastating, but I also knew I couldn't let Marcus continue his crimes just to maintain access to them. If I gave in to his threats now, I'd be teaching Lily and Rose that family members could steal from each other without consequences, that love meant accepting abuse and exploitation. That wasn't the lesson I wanted them to learn about family relationships. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed Detective Rodriguez, the financial crimes investigator who'd been assigned to my case. Mrs. Chen, I wanted to update you on the investigation. We've obtained warrants for your son's financial records, and the evidence you provided has been extremely helpful. We should be ready to make an arrest within the next few days. Thank you, Detective. I appreciate you keeping me informed. I also wanted to prepare you for what's likely to happen next. Once we arrest your son, this case will become public record. There may be media attention, especially given the nature of the charges. Elder financial abuse cases often attract coverage, particularly when they involve family members. The thought of my family's situation becoming public was humiliating, but I'd already considered that possibility. I understand. I'm prepared for whatever consequences come from seeking justice. There's something else. We've been investigating similar cases in the area, and your son's pattern of behavior suggests this might not be his first time engaging in financial fraud. We may need to look into whether he's committed similar crimes against other elderly victims. The possibility that Marcus had been running cons on other elderly people made me feel sick. Had he learned his techniques by practicing on strangers before moving on to his own family? Were there other mothers somewhere dealing with the same betrayal I was experiencing? Detective, whatever you need from me to investigate this fully, I'm prepared to cooperate. Thank you, Mrs. Chen. Your willingness to pursue charges in this case may help us protect other potential victims. After I hung up, I sat in my quiet house and tried to process everything that had happened. In the span of a few hours, I'd confronted my son with evidence of his crimes, listened to him threaten to keep my granddaughters from me, and learned that he might be a serial predator of elderly victims. The son I'd raised, the man I'd sacrificed everything for, was not just a disappointment, he was a danger to vulnerable people. But as devastating as that realization was, I also felt something I hadn't experienced in months: peace. For the first time since Marcus's deception began, I wasn't waiting for the next emergency call, worrying about my dwindling savings, or questioning my own judgment about my family's needs. I knew the truth, and I was taking action to address it. Whatever happened next, I would face it with clarity and strength, knowing that I'd chosen justice over enabling, consequences over family denial. My phone buzzed with a text message from Jessica. Eleanor, Marcus told me what happened. Please call me. We need to talk. I stared at the message for a long moment, wondering what role Jessica had really played in Marcus's scheme. Had she been an innocent victim of his lies, or had she been a willing accomplice in the fraud? Her social media posts suggested she knew exactly how they were funding their lifestyle, but I hadn't yet determined the full extent of her involvement. I decided not to respond to her text immediately. If Jessica wanted to talk, she could do it through lawyers once Marcus was arrested. I wasn't going to give her the opportunity to manipulate me or gather information about my evidence before the criminal case moved forward. Instead, I made myself a cup of tea and sat down to write a letter to Lily and Rose, a letter I would save for them to read when they were old enough to understand what had happened. I wanted them to know that their grandmother loved them enough to seek justice when their father committed crimes, even knowing it might cost me my relationship with them. I wanted them to understand that sometimes love requires difficult choices, and that enabling criminal behavior isn't actually loving, it's harmful to everyone involved. As I wrote, I thought about the Marcus I'd raised, the little boy who'd been so eager to please, so quick to apologize when he made mistakes, so devastated when he disappointed anyone he cared about. That child had grown into a man who felt entitled to steal from his own mother, who showed no genuine remorse when confronted with his crimes, who threatened to weaponize his children against their grandmother. What had gone wrong? Where had I failed in teaching him the difference between right and wrong, between earning something and taking it, between loving someone and exploiting them? But as I reflected on Marcus's childhood and young adulthood, I realized that the warning signs had probably been there all along. His charm had always been a little too calculated, his apologies a little too strategic. He'd learned early how to manipulate people's emotions to get what he wanted, and I'd probably enabled that behavior by being too forgiving, too willing to believe his explanations. Now he was facing the consequences of a lifetime of choosing manipulation over honesty, and I was finally strong enough to let those consequences happen. The next morning brought another call from Detective Rodriguez. Mrs. Chen, we've made the arrest. Your son is in custody, and he'll be arraigned this afternoon. You should know that when we searched his residence, we found evidence of additional financial crimes. It appears he's been running similar schemes on at least 3 other elderly victims in the area. I closed my eyes, feeling sick at the confirmation that Marcus was indeed a serial predator. Detective, do those other victims know what happened to them? We're in the process of contacting them now. In some cases, the victims may not even realize they've been defrauded. Your son was very sophisticated in his approach, he seems to have studied each victim's vulnerabilities and tailored his stories accordingly. The thought of other elderly people being manipulated and stolen from the way I had been made me even more determined to see this case through to conviction. Marcus wasn't just a son who'd made bad choices, he was a criminal who specialized in exploiting vulnerable people. Will I need to testify at trial? Almost certainly. Your case is the strongest we have, with the most documentation and evidence. Your testimony will be crucial for establishing his pattern of behavior. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen and tried to process the fact that my son was sitting in a jail cell, probably still believing that he could charm or manipulate his way out of the consequences of his actions. Part of me felt grief for the child he'd once been, but a larger part felt relief that he would no longer be able to victimize other elderly people. My phone rang again, and this time the caller ID showed Jessica's number. I hesitated, then decided to answer. If she was going to try to manipulate me on Marcus's behalf, I wanted to know about it. Eleanor, thank God you answered. I just heard about Marcus. This is all a terrible misunderstanding. Is it, Jessica? Of course it is. Marcus would never steal from you. He loves you. We both love you. There has to be some explanation. I listened to Jessica's performance, noting the same calculated innocence that Marcus had used so effectively. She was trying to sound shocked and confused, but her words were too carefully chosen, her emotions too controlled. Jessica, where did you think the money was coming from? What money? The money for your luxury apartment, your new car, your expensive vacations, your designer clothes. If Marcus was unemployed and you'd lost your job, as you both claimed, where did you think the money for your lifestyle was coming from? There was a long pause. Marcus said he'd gotten some freelance work. He said he was handling our finances while I looked for a new position. And you never questioned why someone doing freelance work could afford a $500,000 condo and a brand new BMW? Another pause. I trusted my husband to handle our money responsibly. Her answers were too smooth, too prepared. Jessica had clearly anticipated these questions and rehearsed her responses. She was trying to portray herself as an innocent wife who'd been kept in the dark about her husband's financial crimes. But I remembered her social media posts, her expensive purchases, her casual spending on luxury items. She'd been living the lifestyle that my stolen money had funded, and she'd known exactly where it was coming from. Jessica, the police have evidence that you were involved in Marcus's scheme. They have records of purchases you made, places you went, things you bought with money that came from defrauding me. You're going to be arrested too. That's not true. I never stole anything from you. Maybe you didn't make the phone calls or create the fake emergencies, but you certainly benefited from the proceeds of those crimes. You spent stolen money on clothes, vacations, and luxuries while lying to me about your financial situation. Eleanor, please. Think about the girls. Whatever Marcus did, Lily and Rose are innocent. They need their mother. You can't let them take me away from my children. The same emotional manipulation Marcus had tried, using my granddaughters as shields against the consequences of their crimes. But Jessica's approach was more subtle, more calculated. She was positioning herself as another victim of Marcus's deception while simultaneously appealing to my maternal instincts. The girls need parents who are honest and law-abiding, I said firmly. They need to learn that actions have consequences, and that stealing from family members isn't acceptable behavior. But what if you're wrong? What if Marcus really was just trying to provide for his family and made some poor decisions? Do you want to destroy two little girls' lives over money? Jessica, stop. I have evidence of over a year of systematic fraud and theft. I have documentation of purchases you made with stolen money. I have recordings of fake emergency calls and proof that the crises Marcus described never happened. This isn't about poor decisions, it's about criminal behavior. Money can be repaid. Families can't be rebuilt once they're destroyed. You should have thought about that before you chose to participate in defrauding me. I hung up without waiting for her response. Jessica's call had confirmed what I'd suspected. She was fully aware of Marcus's crimes and had been a willing beneficiary of the stolen money. Her attempt to portray herself as an innocent victim was just another layer of the deception she and Marcus had been perpetrating. The next few hours brought a steady stream of phone calls from numbers I didn't recognize. Word of Marcus's arrest had apparently spread, and various friends and family members were calling to express shock, offer support, or try to convince me to drop the charges. I stopped answering the phone after the fifth call from someone who wanted to tell me that families should stick together and that I was being too harsh on Marcus. Apparently, in some people's minds, being stolen from by your own son was less important than maintaining family unity. But there was one call I did take, from my lawyer, confirming that Jessica had indeed been arrested as an accomplice in the fraud scheme. She was being charged with conspiracy and money laundering for her role in spending money that she knew had been obtained through criminal activity. Eleanor, you should prepare yourself for a long legal process. These cases often take months, or even years to resolve, especially if the defendants choose to fight the charges rather than accept plea agreements. I'm prepared for that. I want to see this through to the end. There's something else you should consider. Marcus and Jessica's legal troubles may affect your access to your granddaughters. If both parents are convicted and sentenced to prison time, the girls may end up in foster care or with Jessica's family. The possibility that Lily and Rose might disappear from my life entirely was heartbreaking, but I'd already accepted that risk when I decided to seek justice. I couldn't enable Marcus's criminal behavior just to maintain access to my granddaughters. I understand. But I can't let concern for my own relationship with the girls override the need to stop Marcus from victimizing other people. That evening, I sat in my quiet house and reflected on everything that had happened. In the span of a few days, I'd gone from being the victim of a sophisticated financial fraud to being the primary witness in a criminal case against my own son and daughter-in-law. It was devastating and liberating at the same time. For months, I'd been living with the stress of constant emergency calls, the confusion about my dwindling savings, the worry about my family's welfare. I'd been manipulated, lied to, and stolen from by the people I loved most. But now, finally, the truth was out. Marcus and Jessica were facing consequences for their choices. Other elderly victims would be protected from their schemes. And I was free from the cycle of deception and exploitation that had been consuming my life. As I prepared for bed, I made a decision. Tomorrow, I would start rebuilding my life. I would focus on my own health and happiness, rather than constantly worrying about Marcus's manufactured crises. I would reconnect with friends I'd been neglecting while dealing with my family drama. I would restart the activities I'd given up to save money for Marcus's emergencies. I would remember who I was before I became a victim of my son's crimes. And someday, when Lily and Rose were old enough to understand, I would tell them about the grandmother who loved them enough to seek justice, even when it cost her everything. The trial began 6 months later on a crisp October morning. I walked into the courthouse wearing my best navy dress, the same one I'd worn to Marcus's college graduation 15 years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now testifying against the same son I'd once been so proud of. Marcus sat at the defendant's table in a suit I recognized as one I'd helped him buy for job interviews after college. He looked thinner than I remembered, his face gaunt and pale from his time in custody. When our eyes met across the courtroom, I saw a flicker of the little boy he'd once been, but it was quickly replaced by the cold stare of a stranger. Jessica sat beside him, her designer clothes replaced by a modest gray suit that probably came from a discount store. Her hair was pulled back severely, and she wore no makeup. The transformation from the glamorous young woman in her social media photos to this subdued defendant was startling. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Ms. Martinez, had spent weeks preparing me for my testimony. She'd warned me that Marcus's defense attorney would try to portray me as a vindictive mother seeking revenge against her son for some imagined slight. They would attempt to paint my pursuit of justice as family drama rather than criminal prosecution. Mrs. Chen, Ms. Martinez began, please tell the court about your relationship with your son before these incidents began. I spoke clearly into the microphone, describing the loving relationship I'd believed we had, my pride in Marcus's accomplishments, my joy in becoming a grandmother. I explained how I'd always been willing to help my family financially when they had legitimate needs. And when did the defendant first contact you asking for money? I recounted that first phone call in March, Marcus's story about Jessica losing her job, my immediate willingness to help. The prosecutor walked me through each subsequent request, each fabricated emergency, each lie told to extract money from my savings. When we reached the evidence portion of my testimony, Ms. Martinez displayed the social media photos on large screens visible to the jury. The contrast between Marcus's claims of poverty and the reality of his luxury lifestyle was stark and undeniable. Mrs. Chen, this photo was posted by the defendant's wife on the same day he called you claiming they needed emergency rent money to avoid eviction. Can you describe what you see in this image? I looked at the photo of Jessica lounging by a resort pool, expensive sunglasses perched on her head, a cocktail in her hand. I see someone who doesn't appear to be worried about losing her home. The defense attorney, a slick young man named Thompson, tried his best during cross-examination to make me appear vindictive and unreasonable. He suggested that I'd misunderstood the nature of Marcus's requests, that these were loans rather than gifts, that family financial arrangements shouldn't be subject to criminal prosecution. Mrs. Chen, isn't it true that you were happy to help your son when you thought he needed assistance? I was happy to help when I believed his family was genuinely in crisis, I replied. I was not happy to be defrauded. But you never asked for any documentation of these supposed emergencies, did you? You never required proof before sending money? I trusted my son to tell me the truth. I didn't think I needed to investigate my own child's claims about his family's welfare. Thompson pressed harder, trying to portray my investigation as excessive and my pursuit of criminal charges as vindictive. Mrs. Chen, when you discovered inconsistencies in your son's stories, why didn't you simply confront him privately? Why involve law enforcement? Because stealing $26,000 from your elderly mother isn't a family disagreement, Mr. Thompson. It's a crime. The prosecutor had prepared me well for this line of questioning. Every attempt to minimize Marcus's actions or portray me as unreasonable was met with clear, factual responses that emphasized the criminal nature of his behavior. When Marcus took the stand in his own defense, I watched the son I'd raised try to charm a jury the same way he'd charmed me for months. He spoke eloquently about the pressures of providing for his family, his fear of disappointing his successful wife, his desperation to maintain their lifestyle. But when the prosecutor cross-examined him, the facade cracked quickly. She walked him through each lie he'd told me, each fake emergency he'd fabricated, each unauthorized charge he'd made to my account. Mr. Chen, you testified that you intended to pay your mother back. Yet the evidence shows that over 14 months, you never made a single payment toward the money you'd borrowed. Can you explain this discrepancy? Marcus fumbled for an answer, his smooth confidence evaporating under scrutiny. I was waiting until our financial situation stabilized. While simultaneously purchasing a luxury condo, a new BMW, and taking expensive vacations? Those were investment purchases. We needed to maintain our credit rating. It was painful to watch my son destroy himself with obvious lies and contradictions. The Marcus I'd raised had been intelligent and articulate, but the criminal version of him was sloppy and transparent in his deceptions. Jessica's testimony was even more damaging to their case. She attempted to portray herself as an innocent wife who'd been kept in the dark about her husband's criminal activities, but the prosecutor's evidence made that claim laughable. Ms. Chen, you testified that you believed your husband was earning money through freelance work. Yet bank records show that you personally made purchases totaling over $8,000 using funds that had been fraudulently obtained from his mother. Can you explain how you thought your family could afford these expenditures? Jessica's explanation about trusting her husband to handle their finances rang hollow when confronted with evidence of her direct participation in spending the stolen money. The most damaging testimony came from Detective Rodriguez, who explained how the investigation had uncovered Marcus's pattern of targeting elderly victims. He detailed the sophisticated techniques Marcus used to research his victims' vulnerabilities and tailor his approach accordingly. Mrs. Eleanor Chen was not the defendant's only victim, Detective Rodriguez testified. We identified 3 other elderly individuals who were defrauded using similar methods. In each case, the defendant researched the victim's family situation and financial status before initiating contact with fabricated emergencies. The revelation that Marcus was a serial predator of elderly victims shocked even me. I'd known he'd stolen from others, but hearing the details of his systematic approach to targeting vulnerable people was devastating. One of his other victims, an 80-year-old widow named Margaret Foster, testified about how Marcus had approached her after her husband's funeral, claiming to be a financial advisor who could help her manage her inheritance. Over 6 months, he'd convinced her to invest $12,000 in various fake opportunities. He was so kind and understanding, Mrs. Foster said, her voice shaking. He said he reminded him of his own grandmother, and he wanted to make sure I was protected from people who might try to take advantage of me. The cruel irony of Marcus positioning himself as Mrs. Foster's protector while simultaneously robbing her was not lost on the jury. I watched their faces as they processed the full scope of his predatory behavior. The defense's closing argument focused on Marcus's supposed desperation to provide for his family and his intention to eventually repay the money. Thompson painted him as a loving father who'd made poor choices under pressure, rather than a calculating criminal who specialized in exploiting elderly victims. But the prosecutor's closing was devastating in its clarity. Ms. Martinez systematically dismantled every excuse Marcus had offered, using his own words and actions to demonstrate the premeditated nature of his crimes. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is not about a son asking his mother for help. This is about a sophisticated criminal enterprise designed to defraud vulnerable elderly victims. The defendant didn't steal from his mother because he was desperate, he stole from her because he knew she loved him enough to believe his lies. She displayed the timeline of Marcus's crimes alongside evidence of his luxury purchases, showing how each fraudulent request was immediately followed by recreational spending. This defendant didn't steal money for necessities. He stole money for golf clubs and spa days, for resort vacations and designer handbags. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned with guilty verdicts on all counts, I felt a complex mixture of relief and sorrow. Justice had been served, but the cost had been the complete destruction of my relationship with my son. Marcus showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, but Jessica broke down crying. I wondered if her tears were for her children, her future, or simply for getting caught. At sentencing 2 weeks later, I was given the opportunity to address the court with a victim impact statement. I'd spent days writing and rewriting what I wanted to say, struggling to find words that could adequately express the depth of Marcus's betrayal. Your Honor, I began, my voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. My son stole more than money from me. He stole my sense of security, my trust in family relationships, and my peace of mind in my golden years. I looked directly at Marcus as I continued. I raised him to be honest, compassionate, and responsible. I sacrificed my own comfort to ensure he had every opportunity to succeed. His decision to repay that sacrifice by stealing from me and exploiting my love for his children is a betrayal that goes beyond financial crime. But perhaps most importantly, Your Honor, this wasn't just about me. My son targeted other elderly victims with the same callous calculation he used against his own mother. He studied our vulnerabilities and exploited our trust. His crimes represent a fundamental violation of the respect and protection that elderly people deserve from society. I paused, gathering my strength for the final portion of my statement. I don't ask for mercy for my son because he's never shown genuine remorse for his actions. Even now, faced with overwhelming evidence of his crimes, he continues to make excuses and blame others for his choices. Until he accepts responsibility for what he's done, he remains a danger to vulnerable people. The judge sentenced Marcus to 6 years in state prison for elder financial abuse, fraud, and theft. Jessica received 3 years for her role as an accomplice. Both would be required to pay full restitution, though I knew the likelihood of recovering my stolen money was minimal. As the bailiff led Marcus away in handcuffs, he turned to look at me one last time. For a moment, I thought I saw genuine emotion in his eyes, perhaps regret, or even love. But then his expression hardened into the cold stare I'd become familiar with during the trial. I hope you're satisfied, he said, his voice carrying across the courtroom. You've destroyed your own family for money. Even then, even after everything that had happened, Marcus couldn't accept responsibility for his choices. In his mind, I was the villain of this story, the vindictive mother who'd chosen justice over family loyalty. I walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sunshine, feeling emotionally drained but also strangely liberated. For the first time in over a year, I didn't have to worry about Marcus's next emergency call, his next crisis, his next attempt to manipulate me into giving him money. The legal battle was over, but I knew the personal consequences would last much longer. Jessica's parents had been awarded custody of Lily and Rose, and they'd made it clear that I wouldn't be welcome in the girls' lives. In their view, I was the grandmother who'd chosen to destroy their family rather than forgive and forget. The isolation was difficult, but I'd expected it. I'd known when I first called the police that seeking justice might cost me my relationship with my granddaughters. But I also knew that enabling Marcus's criminal behavior wouldn't have been an act of love, it would have been a betrayal of every other elderly person he might have victimized. 6 months after the trial, I received an unexpected phone call from Margaret Foster, one of Marcus's other victims. She'd gotten my number from the prosecutor's office and wanted to thank me for having the courage to press charges. Mrs. Chen, I want you to know how grateful I am that you didn't let him get away with what he did to us. If you hadn't come forward, he'd still be out there hurting other people. Mrs. Foster's call reminded me why I'd made the difficult choice to pursue criminal charges. It wasn't about revenge or vindictiveness, it was about protecting other vulnerable people from Marcus's predatory behavior. Over the following months, I slowly began rebuilding my life. I reconnected with old friends, resumed activities I'd abandoned during the stressful period of Marcus's deception, and focused on my own health and happiness rather than constantly worrying about manufactured family crises. I also discovered something unexpected: I was stronger than I'd realized. The woman who'd been manipulated and stolen from had found the courage to fight back, to demand justice, to protect others from similar harm. The experience had been devastating, but it had also revealed reserves of strength and determination I didn't know I possessed. 3 years into Marcus's sentence, I received a letter from him in prison. The handwriting was the same as the thank you notes he'd written as a child, but the content was very different. Mom, I've had a lot of time to think about what I did. To you and to our family. I know saying I'm sorry doesn't undo the harm I caused, but I need you to know that I finally understand how wrong I was. The letter went on for several pages, detailing his participation in prison counseling programs, his work with other inmates on addiction and mental health issues, his growing understanding of how his actions had affected not just me but his children and his other victims. I don't expect you to forgive me, he wrote near the end. I don't even know if I deserve forgiveness. But I want you to know that the son you raised is still in here somewhere, and he's horrified by what he became. I read the letter several times, looking for signs of the manipulation and calculated emotion that had characterized Marcus's previous attempts at reconciliation. But this felt different, rawer, more genuine, less polished than his usual performances. I wrote back, a short letter acknowledging his words but making no promises about the future of our relationship. Trust, once broken so completely, couldn't be rebuilt with letters and apologies. It would require years of consistent, honest behavior, if it could be rebuilt at all. A year later, I received another letter, this one accompanied by official documentation that Marcus had completed his GED and was enrolled in a bachelor's degree program through the prison education system. He'd also been accepted into a victim advocacy program, where he would help educate other inmates about the impact of financial crimes on elderly victims. I can't undo what I did, he wrote, but maybe I can prevent other people from making the same terrible choices. This time, I called the prison to verify the information in his letter. Everything he claimed was true. Marcus was indeed participating in educational programs and victim advocacy work. More importantly, according to his counselor, he'd shown genuine remorse and significant personal growth during his incarceration. When Marcus was released after serving 4.5 years of his sentence, he didn't contact me immediately. Instead, I heard from his parole officer that he'd found work at a non-profit organization that provided financial literacy education to elderly people, ironic, perhaps, but also appropriate given his intimate knowledge of how financial predators operated. 6 months after his release, Marcus asked his parole officer to arrange a meeting between us. We met at a neutral location, a coffee shop downtown, with his parole officer present to ensure the interaction was appropriate. The man who sat across from me looked like my son but felt like a stranger. Prison had aged him, but it had also given him a humility and gravity that the charming young man I'd raised had never possessed. "Mom, I don't expect anything from you," he began, his voice quiet and serious. "I'm not here to ask for money or help or even forgiveness. I just wanted you to see that I understand now what I did to you, and that I'm committed to spending the rest of my life trying to make amends." We talked for an hour, with Marcus answering my questions about his plans, his work, his efforts to rebuild his relationship with Lily and Rose. He was honest about the challenges he faced as a convicted felon, the limitations on his employment options, the difficulty of reconnecting with his daughters after years of separation. "Jessica and I are divorced," he said matter-of-factly. "She remarried last year, and her new husband has been good to the girls. They're calling him Dad now. Which is probably for the best." The pain in his voice when he talked about losing his children was genuine and heartbreaking. But he didn't ask for my sympathy or try to minimize his responsibility for the consequences of his actions. As our meeting ended, Marcus handed me an envelope. "This is the first installment of the restitution I owe you. It's only $500, but I'll send the same amount every month until I've paid back everything I stole." I looked at the check, amazed that he was actually following through on repayment despite having no legal obligation to do so after completing his sentence. "You don't have to do this," I said. "The court only required restitution during your incarceration." "I know," he replied. "But paying you back is the right thing to do, even if it takes me the rest of my life." Over the following year, Marcus kept his promise. Every month, a check for $500 arrived in my mailbox, accompanied by a brief note updating me on his life and work. He never asked to visit, never pressured me for a deeper relationship, never tried to manipulate me into giving him another chance. Gradually, I began to believe that the change in him might be genuine. The son who'd stolen from me had been entitled, manipulative, and focused only on his own desires. The man sending me these checks was humble, honest, and committed to making amends regardless of whether it benefited him personally. 2 years after our first meeting, I agreed to have dinner with Marcus at my house. It felt strange having him in my home again, but also oddly comforting. We talked about his work, my retirement activities, and carefully avoided the painful topics that still lay between us. As he prepared to leave, Marcus paused at the door. "Mom, I know I can never undo what I did to you. But I want you to know that becoming the kind of man who could steal from his own mother was the worst thing that ever happened to me. Not getting caught, not going to prison, but becoming that person in the first place." I watched him walk to his modest used car, a far cry from the BMW he'd driven while spending my money, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years when it came to my son, Hope. Marcus continued his monthly payments for 5 more years, eventually repaying not just the money he'd stolen but also interest and additional compensation for the stress and trauma his crimes had caused. More importantly, he continued his work with elderly financial abuse prevention, becoming a respected voice in the field precisely because of his personal experience with these crimes. When Lily turned 18, she reached out to me for the first time since her father's arrest. She'd learned the truth about what had happened, and she wanted to understand her grandmother's perspective on the family tragedy that had shaped her childhood. "I used to hate you for sending my dad to prison," she told me during our first conversation in nearly 8 years. "But now I understand why you did it. And I'm proud of you for being strong enough to do the right thing, even when it cost you everything." Our relationship rebuilt slowly, carefully, with both of us aware of the years we'd lost and the pain that had separated us. Rose was more hesitant to reconnect, her memories of the family disruption more vivid and painful, but eventually she too came to understand the choices I'd made and why they'd been necessary. Marcus and I will never have the relationship we once did. Too much has happened, too much trust has been broken and rebuilt for us to simply return to the mother-son dynamic of his childhood. But we've found a different kind of relationship. One based on mutual respect rather than unconditional love, on earned trust rather than assumed loyalty. Sometimes I think about the woman I was before Marcus's betrayal, trusting, generous, always ready to believe the best of my family. That woman was destroyed by her son's crimes, but the woman who emerged from that destruction was stronger, wiser, and more determined to protect herself and others from manipulation and abuse. I learned that loving someone doesn't mean enabling their worst behavior, that family loyalty doesn't require accepting criminal conduct, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is hold someone accountable for their choices. Marcus learned that charm and manipulation can only carry you so far, that every choice has consequences, and that rebuilding trust after betrayal requires years of consistent, honest behavior rather than smooth words and empty promises. We both learned that some betrayals are so profound they change you forever, but that change doesn't have to be entirely destructive. Sometimes it can lead to growth, wisdom, and a deeper understanding of what real love actually requires. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.